In this video, I will be explaining the depth argument for the existence of God and responding to some objections to it. The depth argument is a version of a sustaining causal argument similar to the argument from contingency and the argument from conditions. However, unlike those arguments, the depth argument does not rest upon a version of the principle of sufficient reason, and so may be a stronger argument. It's also an original argument of my own. The depth argument goes like this. The deepest possible dimension of reality must be the ground of reality. The deepest possible dimension of reality must achieve maximized possible properties. Therefore, the ground of reality must achieve maximized possible properties. In order to understand this argument, I will define how the terms are being used. Dimension simply means an aspect of reality. This can include an object, field, mind, etc. Deepest means most fundamental. And by achieve, I simply mean to take on or encompass. And ground of reality simply means the foundational uncaused portion of reality. So premise 1 is stating that the most fundamental aspect of reality possible must be the foundational uncaused portion of reality. This is because if something is as fundamental as it could possibly be, then there is no further more fundamental possible aspect of reality for there to be, even in principle. So the deepest possible dimension of reality would have to be the final stopping point of reality that undergirds the rest of reality. Essentially, it's the bottom floor or ground of reality. Premise 2 of the depth argument then states that the deepest possible dimension of reality must achieve maximized possible properties. The justification for this premise is that if something is the deepest possible dimension, then there is no further unveiling of reality that could take place for it, as it is the final, most fundamental aspect possible. But, as was stated earlier, nothing could even in principle be more fundamental than the deepest possible dimension, so there could not be a further unveiling of reality for the deepest possible dimension. Yet, this then entails that no further conceivable features could be added to the deepest possible dimension. The deepest possible dimension then would have to be maximal in its possible properties. The conclusion then follows that since the deepest possible dimension is the ground of reality, that the ground of reality must achieve maximized possible properties. Yet, what features does this then entail for the ground of reality? Well, it entails that the ground of reality would have to be maximized in presence, since as an existing concrete thing, it would have some degree of presence, but it would have to then have maximized presence. Otherwise, there would be some further degree of presence that it could take on, but then it would not be as deep of a dimension as possible. But since it's the deepest dimension possible, thereby has to have maximal presence or omnipresence. This then entails that the ground of reality cannot have any features that require spatial limitations, such as fingers, cookies, etc. But it would still have maximized features that do not require spatial limitations such as power and intelligence. So, the ground of reality would have to be maximized in power and intelligence as well. Now, one might object at this point that perhaps the deepest possible dimension could be maximized in presence and power, but if intelligence requires a mind, and a mind is an emergent feature of a brain, then since the ground of reality would presumably not have a brain, since it's not spatially limited, then it would not be able to have a mind. Yet, this assumes that consciousness can only be an emergent feature of a brain. However, it's conceivable that consciousness and intelligence could exist without spatial limitations. There's nothing about having spatial limitation that is logically required for the features of consciousness or intelligence. Finally, the ground of reality would need to be maximally empathetic because empathy is a feature that the ground of reality could conceivably have. Yet, one may ask if the ground of reality would then have other psychological features like hate. I would argue that it does, but its hate would be balanced out by its maximal empathy. This then results in a being that has maximal empathy for others and maximal hatred for actions that lack empathy. This would then entail that the ground of reality is a supremely moral being, because it hates what is wrong and it loves beings. So overall, if this argument is accepted, then it entails the existence of a maximally present, maximally powerful, maximally intelligent, and maximally empathetic ground of reality. We can properly call this being God. Now, it's important to recognize that the argument does not have to take a position on whether the ground of reality is timeless or entirely simple. Those are debates independent of the argument. There are a few objections, though, that remain for the argument. One could, of course, object that possibly there might be an infinite series of deeper possible dimensions that goes on forever. However, even if there is an infinite series of possible dimensions, the deepest possible dimension would still undergird this infinite series, and thereby, an infinite series of possible dimensions would not be incompatible with the argument. One could also object that if it is metaphysically necessary that a shallower dimension that is limited in its features exists as the ground of reality, that it would thereby be impossible for the deepest possible dimension, which is maximized in possible features, to then exist as the ground of reality. For example, Joe Schmid raises this type of objection against Professor Josh Rasmussen's argument from arbitrary limits, but I think it could equally apply to the depth argument as well.
Well, it seems entirely possible for there to be necessary unexplained limits. So, for instance, it seems entirely possible that there could, for instance, be just a tiny particle that is such that it has its spatial dimensions and causal powers necessarily. And there doesn't seem to be any contradiction in that. Or you could imagine a sort of quantum field. And it could be such that it necessarily exists and it necessarily has its limited structure and limited causal powers. There just doesn't seem to be anything incoherent about that.
In response to this objection, I would argue that a particle or quantum field would not be as deep of a dimension as conceivably possible, and the deepest possible dimension would thereby be causally prior to a particle or quantum field. So I do not think that a particle or quantum field could be necessary or the ground of reality. Next is another objection raised by Joe in regards to Professor Josh Rasmussen's argument from arbitrary limits, but I think it can also apply to the depth argument, so I will respond to it as well.
It seems as though this argument from limits might not be compatible with Trinitarianism, right? When we have Trinitarianism, we have three persons, right? Not 4, not 20, not 365, and not 7,512, right? So there is a limit with respect to the number of divine beings, namely 3. But there just couldn't be other than 3 divine persons if Trinitarianism is true. So it seems as though there's just no explanation as to why there are 3 divine persons as opposed to 2 or 1 or 10 or 365. And if there could be an explanation per our principle of limits, well then it seems as though it couldn't be in terms of those very persons. So it seems as though we'd have to sort of cite some additional God that's accounting for why there is this Trinitarian God, and that's not going to be palatable. Now one might just retort, well, no, it's just necessarily the case that there are 3 persons in the Trinity, and that explains why there are 3 persons. But now there's a difficulty, right? Because now we can just say like, oh, well, hold on a second. Like if you're bringing in these necessary limits with respect to God, the naturalist can bring in necessary limits with respect to the fundamental nature or the fundamental portion of natural reality, right? It's going to be, for instance, a necessarily existent quantum field, and the quantum field is such that it's going to have its limits obtaining of metaphysical necessity. Why are those limits obtaining? Well, because they're metaphysically necessary, right? So if we're going to cite metaphysical necessity as the explanation of why there's a limited number of Trinitarian persons, well, then it seems as though the naturalist is perfectly within his or her epistemic rights to reject this argument by means of pointing to necessarily obtaining limits in the natural foundation of things. So it seems to sort of undercut the step to God.
I agree that God is necessarily a Trinity, but traditionally this has been explained in regards to God the Father being the first person that begets the second person, the Son, and then the third person, the Holy Spirit, proceeding from the Father and the Son. So contrary to what Joe suggested, I would argue that the number of persons is accounted for by the persons of the Trinity, as God the Father is the unlimited ground of reality that gives origin to the other two divine persons, not by creating them, but by eternally begetting them to also partake of the unlimited ground of reality. So, by being three persons, God does not thereby have a limited ontology at all, or left with no account for how it could in principle be explained why God is a Trinity. A particle and quantum field, though, have a limited structure to begin with, and that is what rules them out from being the deepest possible dimension and ground of reality. There are likely other objections and follow-ups to the arguments that I made that could be raised against the depth argument, such as why God allows suffering, which I addressed in a different video. But I hope this video has helped clarify the argument and how it responds to some of its objections. I have also included in the description of this video links to some discussions I have had on the argument as well, and thanks for watching.